Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay. All right, I think everyone is admitted. So I'd like to introduce Becky. She is our Fall Protection Council Chair. She is going to give us a demonstration on harnesses today. If you have questions, please use the chat function to ask your question, and then we will go ahead and answer all of those at the end. And I'll let Becky take it from here.
Good morning. So we're going to go over harness inspection. So, and those of you who obviously are signed up, this is a 4-part series. So basically what we're doing is we're taking, all of the things that we need to inspect in fall protection equipment, and we're kind of breaking it up so we're not taking so much time from everybody. Plus it's a lot of information all at once, and the harness is probably the biggest, because once you kind of go over the detailed inspection of a harness, it all kind of follows suit. So the fall protection equipment needs to be inspected prior to use by the user, and annually, at least annually, by a competent person other than the user. Now in California, that's every 6 months. And that applies to all fall protection except for SRLs. And so when we have our SRL, we'll actually kind of go a little bit deeper into that. So for harness inspection, it's a documented inspection annually by a competent person other than the user. So I've got my trusty harness here. So when we look at the harness inspection, we're looking at 4 things. We look at hardware, webbing, stitch patterns, and label. So I always tell everybody, grab your harness by your back earring, because usually if you shake it, most of them are kind of like a jacket that you would put on, right? Except for some funky ones like mine that we'll go over in a little bit. And there's one thing that I always go over is that, so we look at hardware. So I always say we'll look at hardware first, because it's the first thing you're going to see and grab onto. So we have the back D-ring. And when you look at this back D-ring, most of them and all the manufacturers get their hardware from now it's 4 different manufacturers. So you'll see some stamping on the metal D-ring. And so I'll show it to you. So you see there's little stamping here and there. And if you have a harness, you can look at it. Some of the coated ones don't have it. And some of the weird looking aluminum ones I haven't found it on. So what you're looking for on there is you're looking for 5M or 5 MBS. And what that means is that this D-ring here is rated for 5,000 pounds up and down, because that's where we connect our fall arrest system to, right? And so it's going to go like this. So it's rated for 5,000 pounds up and down, but it's also pull tested side to side to 3,600 pounds. So we know that the maximum amount of force allowed on our body is 1,800 pounds, both with OSHA and ANSI. So 1,800 times 2 is 3,600. So they're pull tested to 3,600. So when you look at the D-ring, if you find that it's bent or misshapen or anything like that, it's not from a fall, it's from misuse. And by the way, if you drive it over with a forklift, it will bend, only because I've done it. So when we look at metal, we're looking at, for the back D-ring and the front D-ring, we're looking at the shape, right? Making sure that it's still the shape that it like round. We look for cracks. We look for pitting, anything that is going to, and cracks more on the aluminum than the steel. What we run into with the steel is corrosion, especially in the southern states, and then rust. Now, I will tell you that most manufacturers will allow some surface rust. So basically, that means that if you see it and you can wipe it off, that's okay. If it starts to affect the integrity of the metal, that's where we have a problem. So anytime that we're looking at metal, we're looking at anything that affects the integrity of the metal. So a big gouge, corrosion where it starts, you'll feel it. I mean, when you run your hand across the metal, you'll feel it. 9 times out of 10, you'll be able to see it from like a mile away. But so we start with the back deering because that's the first thing that we're going to look at. And then we work our way down the front. Now there's different types of connectors that connect the chest strap. So you have quick connect. And then you have pass through. So its technical term is it called a 2-bar buckle. So the pass through is 2 pieces of metal that pass through. And you always want to take, because there's a piece of metal underneath, so you always want to take the webbing and move up so that now I can see underneath and feel underneath, right? So if it's tight like this, we want to move it as much as we can to make sure that we see underneath. And typically what you'll see is the outer edges along the webbing that will start to get corroded or rust. And then that's when you start looking underneath and if that's affected. Anything that affects the integrity of the metal, that harness now comes out of service. When we take something out of service for failure of inspection, it needs to be destroyed. Because if I take this and I throw this in the garbage, one man's trash is another man's treasure, right? So the best way to destroy a harness, and each company's policy is a little bit different. Sometimes you have to give it to the safety manager. That's sort of going away now. I think most people are saying, okay, that needs to be destroyed now. And the one thing that I talk about, you know, when I'm, especially with subcontractors and general contractors, is that if the harness fails inspection prior to you putting it on, that doesn't mean that you put it on and you continue your work and then you go back at the end of the day and say, oh, this failed. If you see the failure, it needs to be taken care of right then and there. And so to destroy it, in the back deering, you see 2 pieces of webbing that crisscross. If you just cut those 2 pieces of webbing, the harness falls apart. Now there's no way to use it. Some people cut all the metal off and melt it down, whatever. So your chest strap, so you have the pass through or you have quick connect. And quick connect is basically you have to push 2 pins to get it to undo. So it clicks together. If you press one of them and it releases, out of service it comes. So again, not only are we looking at rust, corrosion, anything that affects the integrity of the metal, we're also looking at its functionality. Does it work? Does it close all the way? Okay, if I push one, does it come undone? I have to be able to push both. It would really help if I didn't have this all messed up, but if the harness has a front deering, then you're going to inspect the metal. So basically you're just working your way all the way down the harness. Now, most of the harnesses that are out there, except for 3M and Miller. So 3M has a revolver on most of their harnesses. Some of the other ones like the Deltas don't, it still has the parachute buckle. Miller's has like a covered buckle. So there are some different, but for the most part, most of them have what we call a parachute buckle or a friction buckle. And so basically this buckle, if you can see it, so basically this buckle is spring loaded. So underneath there's a spring in there that looks like an M and it springs back. Now, if that's bent, it needs to come out of service. So there's a little tab that usually if you're in tight spaces, like sometimes stuff, you know, when we get caught on something, we don't necessarily check to see what we're caught on. We just do the big yank, right? And sometimes this will get bent, but when it gets bent, then it doesn't work properly. So the friction with this is based on friction. So when you pull or you fall into it, it bites on. So if this doesn't spring back, out of service it comes. If it's bent, out of service it needs to come. Again, because it's friction based, you're gonna take the webbing and you're gonna wiggle it. And here's where we usually see the biggest problem. So underneath, you're gonna look underneath. But like I said, on all the edges, all the in here, that's where you start seeing it. So when we're out in the field, I'm in Minnesota and there was snow this weekend, so it's not as hot, but down south, it's still warm. So when we're out in the heat, we do what? We sweat, right? And what's in our sweat? Salt. What does salt do to metal? Corrodes it. So, and we all know when we're sweaty, everything kind of starts running down and it gets caught. And the webbing soaks all of that up. Now you have webbing that's sitting nice and tight against that metal and it's all wet. And typically most people throw this in either a job box, a bag, the back seat, the floor, the back of the truck, in a bucket, you name it. There's a million ways I've seen this story, none of which are necessarily the proper way. And that's when we start seeing that. So that salt is in the webbing and it starts just sucking into the metal and we start seeing that corrosion. And in some places it happens much faster than others. I noticed down in a lot of places, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, where you have the humidity and the heat, it doesn't take long for that to take place. So you look at your buckles, and then if it has side D-ring, same thing you're looking at. Now the leg straps, so there's 3 different types of leg straps. So again, you have quick connect, so it's the same as what we talked about with the chest strap. You have to do 2 movements to get it to open. You want to move the webbing so that you can look underneath everything. What most people are familiar with is grommet legs. So like a belt, right? So we have grommets and then we have the buckle. Now, 2 important things to understand with the grommet legs. So you'll have the grommets. If these are destroyed or bent or severely damaged, and a lot of guys will say, but that's not the one I use. Doesn't matter. Because in reality, so back, and this, I'm gonna age myself now. So way back, we used to have loose leaf paper in our 3-ring binders, and we used to put these little stickers on them so the paper would last longer in there. So think of the grommet doing the same thing. It's protecting the webbing, right? Because if we just put a hole in it and then we put the buckle there, it would just tear. So it's protecting that webbing. So what we typically see is we start seeing fraying around that grommet. But if the grommet's damaged, you want to make sure that if it's severely damaged, if it's just a lot of times like it'll get like on the ground and it'll get stepped on and that's not that big of a thing. But if it's severely damaged or, goes from round to oval, then you want to make sure that you remove that from service. But the biggest thing that we're looking for is that webbing still protected by that grommet? And if it's not, then it has to come out of service because that means that the webbing is tearing now. And then we have the other side, the buckle side. So you'll see that this spins. If it's flat, we used to always say, if it's flat on one leg, look at the other leg. And if it's flat, that was your telltale sign the harness was in a fall. Now we have impact indicators because people would never tell us the truth. But if this is flat and doesn't spin, it needs to come out of service. What'll happen is, and it continually happens, is the leg strap will just keep coming undone because that has to spin in order for that buckle to work right. So basically, all the metal, so we're looking for rust, corrosion, deformity, anything that affects the integrity of the metal. The most important is right here because this is where our fall arrest system is connected to. Okay, and so we want to make sure that there's no damage to this. Go back to my other one now. So now we're going to look at the webbing. And so in the webbing, you'll notice, so as you look at webbing, so we're looking for cuts, frays, folds, burns, anything that affects the integrity of the webbing. The webbing is rated for over 5,000 pounds. And some manufacturers have webbing that's way higher than that, and some have just 5,000. I think ours is like 5,000 something, 600, almost 6,000. And so when you look at the webbing, you'll be able to tell right away if there's fraying starting. Typically where we see it are friction points, right? So wherever something is moving and flexing, I started going through harnesses like every 3 months when I was training all the time. I used to be a trainer. So when I was training all the time, I was like, why do I have to keep throwing my harness out? Because the back strap would fray here and here. And I was like, what is going on? But then I realized that when I'm out teaching, my uniform belt would rub as a friction point on that webbing, and eventually it would wear it so that so anytime we had friction points, those are the places we always want to look first, right? So again, you're allowed 1/16 of a cut, fray, hole, or burn. Basically, if you can see it out of service, it comes. This is not anything we want messed with. Unless it's your kid's watercolor paint, no paint is allowed on the polyester webbing. There are manufacturers that make a coated webbing, so it's almost like a flexible PVC that is adhered to the front and back of the webbing, so all the way around it. Some of them have, or you buy a really cheap one and throw it away right away. So paint, anything that dries hard, so sealants, caulk, stuff like that. So what happens is it gets on there and it dries, and then all of a sudden you start moving, and that flexes the fibers, and all of a sudden the fibers will start to just shred. So you have to look at what products you're using around the harness to make sure that you're not going to have an issue. So any of the sealants that dry hard, those are the ones you want to keep an eye on. Or just reach out to the manufacturer and say, have you tested this? Is this okay? I know that my history of 20 years in the industry, we've done a lot of testing on a lot of stuff, which is part of where all the paint comes from and stuff like that. So fray, so we look at our friction points, we look for fraying, we look for cutting, tears, holes, welding. Welders can't wear a normal harness. They need to have one that is a Kevlar or a Kevlar blend. And I think almost every manufacturer has one that has like a Kevlar blend that the weld slide just bounces right off of it. So when we talk about fall protection, it's always about choosing the right tool for the job. So we kind of have to understand what's the application in order to pick the right tool. And there's about 5 million different harnesses, and there's a bajillion manufacturers. It's just about choosing what's right for you guys and whatever application you're using it in. So we just keep going through the webbing. If you have padding on the webbing, you make sure that you move the padding so that you can see all of it. So you have to kind of shove that padding around so that you can inspect underneath it. If the harness is super gross and dirty and full of grease, I used to work with the oil and gas industry all the time. Dawn dish soap is probably the best, the original Dawn dish soap. We used to just keep our harness on and just lather it on and just use a garden hose. Some manufacturers will allow you to wash it. In a washing machine, they give you a little bag. If you really value your washing machine, I would not do this at home. Some people say you can take it to the laundromat. If you do, throw it in and run, because it's going to be really loud and everyone's going to look at you. Obviously, we don't want to put it in the dryer, but the best way to wash it is to just wash it with a mild soap and water. Obviously, we don't want to use anything with a caustic chemical like bleach. Bleach is horrendous for harnesses. We all know that bleach will automatically change the color of something from whatever color it is to white, or really faded, just like we used to do our own jeans, and then 3 weeks later, we'd put them on and they disintegrate. Again, aging myself. It's because that chemical will continue to eat away at the fibers. So when we wash it, we want to use something, mild soap and water. Dawn dish soap honestly is the best for grease and mud and grime and stuff like that. A harness can be removed from service for excessive grossness or soiling or whatever you want to call it. So there's fibers in the webbing, and you'll be able to feel those fibers on a harness. And all of a sudden, if you can't feel them anymore because it's so dirty and full of stuff, then it needs to be removed from service, especially if you can't wash that off. Obviously, don't hang it in the sun to dry. UV damage. So I get asked a lot, UV damage. Hey, here's the deal. When we are hot and sweaty, we go in the shade and we try to be in cool places. In all the years I've been doing this, UV damage, I haven't seen it on a harness that somebody wears all the time, except for in places that they store it when they hang it in the back of their truck, in the back seat. And now, just like when we throw our baseball cap in the back and all of a sudden the blue baseball cap turns white, same thing. If we leave it, then you see like certain parts of it will just get the sun damage from just how it's being stored, not from using it in the hot sun. Because you really have to have it out there continuously for long periods of time. Being the curious one that I am, for UV damage, I actually took a tie-off adapter, like an anchor strap that's all webbing, synthetic webbing, and I put it on a wind turbine in Rio Vista, California, and it took 3 months for the UV damage to actually kind of take hold. And what happens is when we get UV damage, the webbing gets almost like a sticky, chalky feel. And when you bend it or flex it, you'll actually see all the fibers break in it. So when you find UV damage, it's more how it's being stored than it actually is usage. One of the other things we see a lot of, and this is one of my biggest pet peeves ever, is tape. Electrical tape, duct tape. People use it and they'll put it around the back D-ring and say, oh, that's how we know that we did the inspection. No. Keep tape, and there isn't one manufacturer that will say, yeah, throw some tape on there. You need to keep tape as far away from all fall protection equipment as possible. Even OSHA says you can't put tape on tools, right? Hammer, fling, there goes the hammerhead. For 2 reasons. One is I can't inspect underneath it, right? Unless I'm Superman, which I'm not. The other is on the back side of tape is what? Adhesive, glue, right? So now you're out in the environments and all of that stuff is going, yay, right into the stickiness, and it's staying in there. But now what's happening is underneath that, it's cutting those fibers. It's like having glass in there, and it just cuts those fibers, and all of a sudden your harness falls apart. There's a problem with that. So we want to make sure that we keep tape as far away from, if you can't keep your webbing under control, we have these lovely little things called zip ties. So when we do our inspections, we put a zip tie on the back. They make color-coded ones. You can use any color you want. There's glow-in-the-dark ones if you really want to get crazy. And so using zip ties is a much easier and better way. And most manufacturers have, RFID stuff in them now or whatever. Of course, you have to pay for all that stuff, but so webbing, no tape. Be careful of what environments it's being brought into. Is it the right tool for the job? Do you need to look at a different, coated webbing or whatever? If you're painting all the time, obviously you need to look at something else. Welding, same thing. You need to look at something else. So we go all the way down. We look through all the webbing and make sure that there isn't damage, even moving padding and everything else. And look at your friction points. Then we want to look at the stitch patterns. So every manufacturer has a little bit different, so you'll see a stitch pattern. When you flip that, you'll see a fuzzy piece where that's your start and stop stitch. I know that Guardian has like a kind of a round circle stitch pattern. I know that Miller has one that is a double stitch pattern. So you'll actually see 2 start and stop stitches. So each manufacturer's, it's based on their, the thread that they're using, the sewing machine. And so the stitch pattern and the pattern that they use is what gives the strength, right? And anytime you see that stitch pattern, that means that 2 pieces of webbing are sewn together at that point. So we want to keep an eye on that. Most manufacturers will allow 1 broken stitch in any stitch pattern. One manufacturer allows 2 broken stitches in any stitch pattern, is because they use a patented thread. However, if you find a broken stitch, I would just remove it from service. And here's why. In all the years that I've been doing this, very rarely do I ever see broken stitches in a stitch pattern, except for in the subpelvic strap. So the subpelvic strap is the strap that goes underneath your bum. And usually what happens is if people are sitting and scooting or moving around, it's actually pulling. And so that's where you'll actually see the stitch pattern start to break off. But that's the only place in all the years I've been doing this that I've seen broken stitches in a stitch pattern on a harness. Simply because it makes it so strong. So we've done tests where we'll put the stitch pattern in and put a loop on each end and pull it. And the webbing will break before the stitch pattern breaks. So that kind of gives you an indication of how strong that really is. Now, when we're looking at our webbing and our stitch patterns, you're going to see like some manufacturers have what they call a pucker stitch. But to meet the new standard, it actually came out, this change actually came in 2014, that all harnesses have to have impact indicators. Now, the reality is that you're going to deploy your fall arrest system before anything happened with your harness, but because people wouldn't tell the truth, now we have to have impact indicators. And it takes about 450 pounds for them to deploy, 425, 450 usually. So you'll see you'll see a stitch, or sometimes you'll just see like a little fold over. And then if this is deployed, this will tear open and it'll say, hey, if you can read this, this harness has been in a fall, or something like that. And you'll still see some harnesses that don't have them, because not all manufacturers, because ANSI is a compliance and OSHA doesn't necessarily dictate that you have to have impact indicators, you'll see some of the manufacturers that don't put them on, or that it's been around for a while. So we looked at hardware, we looked at webbing, we looked at stitch patterns. Oh, and when you going back to cleaning, the only other thing I'll say is use a garden hose. Don't take it to the car wash and try to pressure wash it, because all you're going to do is you're just going to drive all that dirt and all that grime and all that stuff back into the webbing, and then it's going to do the same thing that underneath the tape it does. It'll just keep shredding those fibers. So basically, you're just, every time you move, it's tearing away at those fibers. So we've looked at webbing, stitch patterns, labels. Oh, labels is last one. So your label. On the label, it's going to tell you the standards that it meets. It's going to tell you the date of manufacture. It'll give you a model number or a product code. Each manufacturer uses a little bit different terminology. It'll give you the size. It'll tell you, most of them will give you a lot number, some of them don't. The most important thing to be able to read on the label is the serial number. Sorry. Miller uses what's called, so when you're looking, you won't find serial number on Miller's. Because they use they use what's called a inspection number. So that's what you have to look for on theirs. But that is a unique identifying number that will always tie back the inspection records to the harness. So OSHA says the label has to be there and it has to be legible. If you cannot read the serial number, then it needs to come out of service. And part of the new ANSI standard is that our little fun stick people came back. So on the label, you'll see, and this was part due to language barriers, right? And so that someone could look and say, okay, this is where I'm allowed to tie this off at. But the most important with the label, and the other thing it'll tell you is how much you can weigh and wear the harness. Now, this is always bigger than just the harness. The weight capacity for the person is not just how much I weigh, it's how much I weigh and all the tools that I plan on carrying, right? So if my tools weigh 25 pounds, then that's what I have to add to my weight. And then I have to look and say, okay, can I wear this harness? But not only do you have to look at the harness, you have to look at every single component. And a lot of times people miss the anchorage connector. So if we look at our harness, and let's just say I weigh 300 pounds. Some guy told me I sound like I weigh 350. I didn't know that weight had a sound, but apparently it does. So let's say I weigh 300. And so this harness says I can weigh, oh my God, my eyes are terrible today, 386. Now I have to look at whatever my connecting device is, whether that's a lanyard or an SRL. What is that? What is my capacity with that? And then I have to look at, so if I weigh 300 and my tools weigh 25, so now I'm at 325, I have to not only look at the harness, oh yeah, I can wear it, but now I have to look at what's connecting me to the structure. And if you're using an anchorage connector, like on a vertical lifeline, a lot of times they'll use like a termination plate or a splice safe or whatever everybody calls it nowadays, or a tie-off adapter, an anchor strap, anything like that, or a beam or a trolley. Anything that we're using as an anchorage connector, we have to look at that capacity as well, because not all of them are going to be the exact same. The standards are getting a little bit better, but manufacturers are, the standard basically reads that most of the products have to be tested for ANSI is 130 to 310. OSHA leaves it a little bit more open to the manufacturer and allowing the manufacturer to test higher and lower than that. So not only do we have to look at the high end, we have to look at the low end as well. And a lot of times that involves an email or a fill something out on their website question. How low have you tested the harness for weight? Because not only do we have more and more people at height now, we have more and more people that are smaller or that weigh less. And so we have to look at that, because for ANSI, it's 130 to 310 is that range. Our does a manufacturer test lower than that? And so that's a question for each manufacturer of whatever gear you have in the field. And then you have to look at not only the harness, but we look at all the components. A lot of times we get tunnel vision with the harness and how much I can weigh and wear that we sort of forget about everything else. But again, we have to look at all of it. So, and we tend to focus on the higher end, but then I used to be where I was on the low end. Now I'm not. Now I'm in the middle, so I don't have to worry about it as much. But I didn't weigh enough when I first got into the industry. I didn't weigh enough to deploy anything. I didn't even weigh enough to get some of the controlled descent devices to do what they're supposed to do. with added friction. So we want to make sure that we look at all of that. And so one of the things that we also said we would discuss is proper fit. So once we've inspected our gear, now keep in mind that the gear is inspected prior to use. It doesn't have to be documented. Some companies are actually making people document it now. If you do that, that's totally cool. I think it's important because, as I've stated, probably for the last 5 years, almost every time I've spoken to anyone, that inspection is the biggest thing that we're missing in the field, because we get so used to grabbing our harness out of our bag and just putting it on and not doing that inspection. And then all it takes is that one moment, right? And so now we want to put our harness on. And of course, I don't have a small one, and this isn't the one that I usually wear. I did bring mine in. Mine just looks a little different and won't necessarily be exactly the same. So we grab it kind of by the back of the earring and you put it on like a jacket. Maybe. Everything's all twisted. Leg straps. So I always say when you're putting your harness on, always do it the same way all the time. Because if we change it up, then we tend to forget things. And I've watched it happen so many times in class where people put their harness on, they change it up, and all of a sudden they forget to do up their leg straps. And they start climbing. And it's like, wait, what? So and buddy checks are really important. So always make sure that somebody else is checking, because we don't have eyes in the back of our head, so we can't always see everything. So when we put our harness on, the chest strap should be straight across the chest. It shouldn't be high, it shouldn't be low. The D-ring should be in between your shoulder blades. And the leg straps, I'll have to back up now. So you want to go, you don't want it super tight that you can't move. Like some guys get all paranoid in class and they're like, I can't move. But you don't want them so loose that they end up down here, right? So you want it to be 4 fingers flat, 2 fingers sideways. If you can make a fist in that webbing, it's too loose. Your subpelvic strap, this little strap here, needs to be underneath your butt. If it's all the way up here on your belt, that's just asking for an atomic wedgie. That does not feel good. What we see a lot now is the leg straps are like this. And I will say that in areas where, especially like the Midwest, and some of the other areas where, you know, it's cold in the morning but warmer in the afternoon, especially in the spring and fall, having a harness with grommet legs where you you can see, you can feel everything. They're easier to adjust. They tend to be a little bit easier. But for some people, they like the quick connect legs. Pass through, they tend to not stay very well. So this is typically what we end up seeing, is that it's all the way down here. Now, think about this. So you fall, and all of a sudden, you've built up velocity, whether it's a short fall or a longer fall. Let's just say I have a 6-foot lanyard on, so I'm going 6 feet whether I like it or not. And so I'm building up that velocity, right? And all of a sudden now all this webbing is going to come flying up into place. I don't really want it to, but it's all going to come flying up really, really fast. and it does a lot of damage. There's pictures out there, you can Google it, you can look it up. We used to use them, but they're gross. It's not a pretty thing. The other thing we see a lot of is the D-ring is always way down here or way up high. Typically it's way down here. And so keep in mind, remember, body belts are illegal now. And part of the reason that they're illegal is because they cause internal damage from that fall over and that quick movement into bending forwards. And so we want to make sure that it's not way down here, but it's directly in between your shoulder blades. A lot of what we see now is they just drop them and just walk around. And if anybody saw my presentation in Vancouver, this webbing I just said was rated for over 5,000 pounds. If something gets a hold of this and it's still buckled here, I'm in trouble because I'm going for a ride, right? Now my favorite is the new one. So this is what we're seeing now. And I don't want to pick on scaffold builders, but they do it all the time. So they loop them and then they leave it like this because now it looks like what? It looks like, you know, because there's in scaffolding, you have your guardrail stuff up. So it looks like I have it on. And some will get even clever enough, they'll stick it in their pocket. I give a lot of these guys credit for creativity. But that loop, A, you're gonna fall out of your harness. B, that loop is creating now something to get hung up on or caught on. So just to recap, so we look at the hardware, we look at the webbing, we look at the stitch patterns, and we look at the labels. And I really hope I didn't forget anything. If the padding, if it has padding on it, so if it has padding like this, or a waist belt padding, if that gets damaged, it doesn't matter. All that is, that's for comfort. It doesn't affect the functionality of the harness. The other thing I do want to mention is that in conversations with some of the OSHA investigators is that, you know, typically most companies have a Excel spreadsheet and it has a serial number and then it has pass fail. The problem is that companies have several different manufacturers or the people bringing their own. It's hard to manage, right? And so what OSHA's looking at now is they haven't said anything too detailed, but they're saying they're not really allowing the spreadsheets unless you keep a manual for each different style of harness that you have or each different manufacturer, so that you do know, because when you inspect a harness, it has to be done per the manufacturer's recommendations, right? So you have to look at, and almost all the manufacturers have an inspection log. If you create your own, that's totally fine. Just make sure that you keep one of the manuals. You don't have to keep one for every one of them. You just have to keep one manual. And most of them you can get online now anyway. You know, go online and download the manual. So you just have to inspect it according to the manufacturer. And so that's probably one of the most important things, but that they want to see that you know what manufacturer gear you have out there and that you know what they require, because each one of them says something just a little bit different. But for the most part, when you're looking at all of them, you're looking at all those same things: hardware, webbing, stitch patterns, labels. Basically what we're looking for is anything that affects the integrity of this. This is rated for over 5,000 pounds and it is designed to save our lives if we inspect it properly and if we wear it properly. If we don't do those two things, you know, and something happens, that's one of the first things you're going to look at is where's your inspection records. And so knowing where that's at is really important too. All right. Jack, do you want me to look at the chat thing or?
However you want to do it. Do you want me to read? Are you do the question?
Oh, it's my favorite, the Sherby question. Okay, we'll start with the top one.
Okay, this one's from Robert Miller. What if the grommets spin on the leg strap but show no wear? I was told if they spin, the harness is bad.
I would agree with that, only for the simple fact that if you think about it, it's protecting the webbing. So if it's loose enough to spin, it's no longer going to protect that webbing, and it won't take much for that to come out. So, and then it won't be protecting that webbing at all anymore.
Next question is also from Robert Miller. What about a harness that has a name on it with a Sharpie?
Oh, now the other people answered for me. So here's what I'm going to tell you. There are no other manufacturers except for 3M that will allow you to write on the webbing. They have all given blank spaces in the label for you to write your name. 3M now changed it to you have to use their special 3M harness marker. Used to be a sharper. Years ago when I worked at Capital Safety, we would allow people to write on there with a Sharpie. Some companies wouldn't allow it because you had to prove that you used a Sharpie, because we don't know what chemicals are in all of them. And when we start testing chemicals on webbing, it kind of gets a little hairy. But I do know that there are none of the other manufacturers, as of the last time I asked most of them. So it would be reaching out to the manufacturer of the gear that you have to find out if they allow it. But I do know that 3M changed it to you have to use their 3M special harness marker, which I'm assuming is probably like a Sharpie. But 3M is the only one that has said that in the past. And then after the 3M purchase, it became the 3M harness marker that you have to use.
And the next comment is from Sean McDonald. It says 3M says it's okay to write on their harness with a Sharpie, probably because they make their own Sharpie.
There you go.
And Jason says, are there any regulations that state a female worker needs to wear a harness designed for a woman?
No. The only thing that I'll say, and I did a presentation at the Tower Show for choosing the right harness for females. Most of the time females, you'll notice my harness didn't look anything like the other ones. My harness is very different, and this is the harness I wear. It's one I wear all the time. It's one that you step into. But the thing that you have to keep in mind, for women, you just have to wear it properly, right? And so it has to be across the chest. If it's above, it'll end up choking them out. If it's below, it actually causes damage. So it has to be straight across. Now, some don't necessarily like that. So it's more about, for women, it's just more about finding that harness that fits them comfortably, because most of them are designed by men. But there is no regulation that says that female has to wear a harness designed for a female.
Next question is also from Jason. He would like to know if there are any statistics for harness failure involved in a fall scenario.
So here's what I do know, and this may or may not answer the question. So when I've spent the time talking with the OSHA investigators, most of the fatalities or injuries and falls that are using fall protection is because the harness wasn't inspected properly. So the failure comes from not inspecting it. The failure doesn't come from the manufacturer. I can't even think of ever that has actually been the case. So it's either that it was not inspected properly, or that it was used in and a lot of times this happens, it was used in a manner that it was not designed to be used, or that it just wasn't used at all. And so those are the three things that typically, I would say 99% of the time for OSHA investigations with a fall and fall arrest equipment, that's it. That, and like I said, all the years I've been doing this, there isn't from a manufacturer failure. Because there's so much testing that's involved. Now, that's not to say if you don't do some pretty unique things, like there's a lot of companies out there that they spend a lot of time and money and energy trying to break stuff, but again, you have to have it just right. And all these things have to take place for that to happen. But that's part of why ANSI keeps digging, is like, it's always that, what's the worst somebody can do with this, and how can we prevent it? How can we help? And so that's kind of where ANSI has sort of driven the way that they look at things, is, what's the worst that somebody can do with this? And let's keep trying to, within reason of keeping it simple to use.
And I do not see any other questions. Does anyone else in the audience have any questions for Becky?
You can ask them too. You don't have to use the chat feature.
I got one more question, Becky.
Yeah.
Becca, do you foresee SRLs switching from a nylon retractable to a cable retractable in the near future? It seems like a lot of the bigger companies are going that way.
Yes, and that's because of the ANSI standard that changed. So in 2021, ANSI changed the standard from Class A and Class B to Class 1 and 2. And so it was based on, the old one was based on lock-off distance. So that speed and inertia when it locks off. Now it's based on where it's anchored to. So if it's directly overhead, that's Class 1. Everything else is Class 2. And what that really means is that everything else becomes leading edge. And so webbing over leading edge tends to become a not so good thing. Now, there are a couple manufacturers that have been working really hard on having a web leading edge SRO, or a Class 2 now. I gotta get used to saying that. It's hard to get used to. But so I think you're gonna see everything go to cable for right now. And then I think you're gonna see, as people try to go through that testing process and find unique, webbing, or have a webbing manufacturer design something for that type of application. It's tough, because when you think about webbing and you put it under tension, so now it's locked off, and then you run it across the sharp edge. Even the best webbing out in the world, even the Kevlar, you do that, and it's gonna, that's how we cut webbing, right?
Exactly.
So
Not
yeah, I
only
think you're
that,
gonna
but
see that.
the replacement costs coming down the road too. If everybody has a nylon retractable or a nylon lanyard and they have to go to a cable system, the cost can be quite high.
Yes. So what I will say, I'll probably get slapped for saying this, but so what I will say is this. So I will say that everything that you have in the field right now, and I have a letter to back it up from ANSI, that everything that you have in the field right now does not need to be replaced. You keep using it until, it fails inspection or has been impacted, right? So if it's been in a fall, then it comes out of service. Now, going back to a harness inspection or equipment inspection, if it's been in a fall, typically you're going to want to give it to the safety manager, and it gets bagged and tagged for a year. Also, with the inspection records, OSHA requires you to keep them. Even if you fail a harness and throw it away, they require you to keep the records for 3 years. But the other part of the SRL is that, remember that ANSI is a compliance board that sets the standards for manufacturers. OSHA has not gotten into any of that detail. So, I think you're going to see some manufacturers take a little longer to kind of switch over.
It's a little bit different up here in Canada too. Yeah, it's a little bit different up here in Canada too.
Right, and so that's what I was getting to, so a lot of times what happens is people will wait to see what CSA is going to do, because typically for most of the standards, they mirror each other. I mean, they're a little bit different. Most of the time they just word it all differently, but you'll see that kind of that, especially global companies that do both, you'll see them kind of waver and say, okay, what's CSA going to do? And then go that direction. And CSA still it's the same standard as it was in 2018. They haven't, and I've asked, and there hasn't, because I'm not on that stream. I sit on the other stream for rescue.
Right.
But I haven't heard of any changes. Sometimes they go, the ANSI's doing whatever, and then it takes a while.
They have changed the lanyard length for swing stages.
Yes.
We've
30
gone
inches,
like,
I believe it is.
yeah, that's what it is up there now. But there's nothing really written in stone. I mean, they varied the regulations a little bit. They don't specifically say swing stage. At least Mike and I here in our swing stage manager were looking for it the other day, and we couldn't find it in the standard anywhere. But we know it has changed.
It's just in CSA, and it's only for fall arresters. So basically, they shoved it in that way.
Right.
And so the manufacturers kind of have gone, they have to follow CSA. So
Yeah, we got all new ones
that's
anyway. So yeah.
Any other questions? No, everybody's asleep.
It's early on the West Coast.
It sure is. All right. And then Jackie, I believe we put a sample inspection list.
Yep, we sure did. And
Yeah.
I can share that in the chat so that everyone can have access to your fall protection page.
Yeah.
Let me get there. And then our next one of these is,
January, I
Let's-
believe, right?
yep, January 19th at 10 a.m. So if you have not registered for that, go ahead and get registered for it, and you'll get the call-in information in the confirmation, and then I'll send a calendar invite just like we did today.
Awesome.
Well, hopefully it was beneficial.
Very much so.
All right. Well, everybody have a great rest of your day.
Yep,
Thanks very
thank you,
much.
Becky. And there's that link if everybody wants to check it out. So,
Thanks, Jackie.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.
all right, we'll see you next time.
All right, be
Thanks,
safe.
Becky.
Bye.
Bye.